welcome back to this video series where we're looking at building our own custom application using UPS API. In this video, we are going to look at building our React application. So this is our actual client application that's going to make a request to the API that we built in the last video, which is then going to proxy that request across to UPS API. And when it gets back its results, it's going to send it back to our front end. So to give you an idea as to what this is actually going to look like, this is where we're heading. So we have our transactions, we've got a list of all of our different individual transactions, and then when we click next, we go on to the next page, and you'll see now next is disabled and previous is enabled because we now have a previous page we can go to, and when we click that, we go back to our first page of results. So I'm going to use Create React App to create this client, but you can use Gatsby or Next or roll your own React app with Webpack or Parcel or anything like that. And now that that's finished, we are going to change into that directory and then run npm start. We are also going to open up this project in VS Code. And you should hopefully see that welcoming rotating image from the Facebook React team. So now we are going to get rid of all of the hard work of that React team and delete everything except for the outermost div. We're then going to render out our transactions here, which is a component that we haven't built yet. And we're just going to replace this uppercase app with lowercase because that's how I like to write my CSS, and get rid of the CSS that it's loading in and also the logo. We're then going to import transactions from /components/transactions. Cool. So now we need to actually create that. So we're going to create a folder called components. And in there, we will create our new component, transactions.js. Now I'm going to import React from React, create a new functional component for our transactions. And from that, I'm going to return just a H1 that says transactions. And I'm going to export this as the default. Cool. So now we see that transactions there on the left. Now we just need to bring in a little bit of styling. So I'm going to create a transactions.css file. Transactions. I'm going to magically populate that with some CSS so you don't have to sit there watching me write it, but you can pause the video at different points in that scroll if you'd like to have a look at what I've written. And then I'm going to import that into my component file. So import transactions.css. Cool, and then we see a little bit of this branding color on the left here, which is very nice. The next thing we're going to do is actually wire up a request to our API. So to do that, we're going to bring in useState and useEffect. So these are two React hooks that are available to us to manage state and lifecycle. We're then going to call useEffect. And inside here, we're just going to call getTransactions, which is going to be a function. It's going to go and get our transactions for us. So then we need to create that getTransactions function. That's going to take in a path, but the default path is going to be /transactions. So that'll make a little bit more sense when we bring in the rest of our logic. But basically, we want to by default grab /transactions, but then if we want to fetch a different path, so when we click our next and previous buttons, we want to be able to pass in that path and be able to access that page of transactions. So then we're going to construct a new URL, which is going to be http:// over port 5000. And then we are going to append onto that our path. So again, that's going to be /transactions this first time. We're then going to use Axios to actually make a request to our API. So we're going to need to install that. I'm going to install Axios. And while that's installing, we can bring in the package, import Axios from Axios. Oh my God. And then we're going to make a request for those resources. So we're going to say axios.get that URL. Now this is going to return us a promise, and so we need to await the response from that promise, which means this needs to be an async. Oh, sorry, not the not the entire component, but the get transaction function needs to be asynchronous. And then when we get back the data from this request, we just want to console log that data out. That is a very incorrect spelling of console log. And before we save, I'm just going to add to our use effect. We only want this to happen when we first mount this component. So passing an empty dependency array as the second parameter will make this only run when we mount the component, and then not run on every single update. Cool. So I'm going to save that. And here on the left, it looks like everything's all good. But when I open up the console, you see we're getting this this cross-origin request blocked. So this is a cause error, which means that we haven't specified which origins we're expecting requests from for our server. And so it's not attaching cross-origin headers to the response. If that doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever, don't stress. All we need to do is change out of this client directory and go into the server directory. And then we need to install a package called cause. And then when we open up our server, I've actually already added these two lines. So in our server index.js, we just need to require the cause package at the top. And then we need to, after we've created a new instance of our app, we just need to say app.use cause. And this is going to run some middleware that's just going to attach some headers for us. Something to keep in mind is this doesn't actually whitelist particular origins. So this is just whitelisting all origins. So no matter where we get a request from, we're still going to attach those cross-origin headers. So it's a good idea to restrict this down to just the origins that you're expecting to get requests from. So when we host this application on Netlify or Now or something like that, we just want to put that URL in here as an origin that is allowed to make a request. Yeah, if that doesn't make any sense to you, I recommend Googling the node cause package and looking into how to specify that. But for now, we have our cause running on every single request. So this middleware is going to run before each of our requests. So at the moment we just have /transactions. Yeah, so it's going to attach those headers for us. So now we're going to start our server. And if we make another request with our application, you'll see we actually get back this object with data and links, and then data is our big array of all of our transactions, or our first 20 transactions anyway. And it's very similar to when we were using Postman. We now have this links, and next is set to this URL that we can make a request to get the next page of results, and previous is just set to null. Great, so if we go back to our component, we now want a way to actually remember this data and then render this data. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new variable, transactions, and declare a setter for that transactions data so we can override it. We're going to use the useState hook, and we're going to set this to false by default. So this allows us to then say, when we want to return our results, first we want to check, do we actually have transactions? So is transactions set to a truthy value? If it is, then we can render our transactions header, or ideally iterate over all of our transactions and render them out. And if we don't have those transactions, then we just want to render out a loading state. So if this is set to a falsy value, it means this hasn't actually resolved yet. We haven't actually changed the value of transactions. So we want to render our loading state. And you'll see the loading state there on the left, even though we have got our results back. And that's because we haven't actually updated the value for our transactions. So here I'm going to call set transactions and pass in that data. And now you'll see transactions instead of loading. So now I'm just going to do a little bit more copy-paste logic so we don't have to sit here while I write it all out. And I'm just going to replace this return with a slightly more fancy return. So you see here, this is doing the same thing. So it's returning, it's checking whether transactions is truthy. If it is, then we're rendering out all this stuff. Otherwise, we're rendering out that fallback to say that we're still loading. So inside this markup, we're just rendering out the transactions heading again. Then we're rendering out a list. We're iterating over each of the actual transactions. So transactions.data is that big array of transactions. We're mapping over each one of those and then calling render transaction. That's just rendering out a list item for each of our transactions with a description and a value. So basically we get the description on the left, and then we get the value of whether that was deducted or credited for each of our transactions. We then have the previous and next buttons that we saw earlier. So these are just buttons where we're using a little bit of logic as to whether we have that previous value or that next value, and then determining whether the button should be disabled or enabled. We've then got a data URL, which is just us attaching an attribute with the URL to fetch that new data, which is just going to help our handle paged transactions function to work out where to make that request. So then our handle paged transactions function looks something like this. So when we call that, when the user clicks one of the buttons, we get the event for that button click, and we grab the data set out of that. So we grab that data attribute and grab the URL of that. If that URL is set to a truthy value, so essentially if there is a next page or there is a previous page, then we want to set transactions back to null. Up here we've set it to false, and here we've set it to null. It's probably more accurate up here to initialize it as null. So when we set it to any falsy value, it's going to put us back in that loading state. So this is just to basically show that loading fallback, and then we're calling get transactions again. And you'll see this time we're passing in that URL. So this is what we were talking about earlier, by allowing us to pass in a path. So when we call this function and don't pass in anything, we're going to localhost over port 5000/transactions. But when we call it by clicking our next button, it's going to be that localhost :5000, but then /transactions page, blah, 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 blah. So that's going to allow us to request the next page of transactions or the previous page of transactions. Cool, so let's save that now, and we should see here on the left that we get that loading state while it's going off to the API or our API and requesting those transactions. Our API is then proxying that request and attaching our authorization header, going off to UPS API, getting those transactions, coming back to our API, and then our API is doing some funky stuff with the relative links that we implemented. So we're transforming that data a little bit, and then we're sending it through to the front end. So that's probably a good pattern to follow if you do need to add any kind of complexity to what you're doing. If you need to transform the response that you get back from UPS API into a different format, it's a good idea to do that in that API layer and kind of isolate all of that complexity there, so that our front end can just be as dumb as possible. So here we've got our transactions. It's iterating out over all of our individual transactions. We've got a previous and next button. As we said before, previous is disabled if we don't have a previous page. We then click next, goes into that loading state to fetch the second page of results. And when that comes back, we display those. And if we click previous now, it goes into that loading state, fetches that stuff, and then displays it. Cool. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, we'll be looking at webhooks, which is a very exciting feature, and will probably be the last video in this series. So I'll see you there.